probably doing too many things in too many slightly disparate fields, but I'm just going to make a thought catalog just to sort of try to coalesce all the things that I have working in my mind. I guess I won't mention the very tawdry practical things that I need to do just to visualize my models better so that I can start to make further progress on integrating certain things. Where to start? So I was talking to someone and explaining to them just some of the models within my system, and it just made me think, because I mean I've been at the precipice of going back into Metagram for such a long time, and I still haven't really dived into it because it's just, I guess I just want to have all my ducks in a row first and have better sort of clearer placard. Yeah, I want to make, I guess, very good summaries of all the models that I have, so then it's easier just to sort of to see what's going on when I go back to Metagram. But the thing about Metagram, which is something that I've just sort of rediscovered for myself, is that the thing that makes it weird is that the circuits, the emotional circuits, the 24 model emotional circuits, are not connected between the circuits of 8. They're connected across. They come in packages of 6, and they're interwoven in packages of 6. And the kind of counteroffer that is described within the 24 model, in how one emotional tone can be counteroffered by another tone, and how you get two different species of counteroffer. I can't even remember how to. I mean, it's sort of, these are all somewhat metaphors, but essentially you get ones that don't discharge. You get counter offers that essentially discharge and completely supplement the emotional tone, and then you get other counter offers which in some sense, like, um they inculcate the last tone, but they sort of move it forward, so they sort of they execute and novate or something like that. I don't know. Or, these are all sort of using legalese as a kind of as a metaphor. Maybe those words should be inverted. The one discharges and the other one executes and novates. But anyway, um, and that is something, actually, and I can't remember if it's more complicated than that. That if some of the emotional tones are in more than one circuit, and they're in different positions in different circuits. I can't remember that. I remember them being actually in set circuit. That I remember thinking that the emotional tone was just set in a particular circuit. But anyway, there's something to do with that, which tells you something about the 12 model, and there's something between the 12 model and the 24 model, which is actually, which is a feature. All those features are because of how the 12 model extracts the emotional tones from the 17 model, because essentially they are being reordered when they are taken from the 17 model, and because of that reordering, it creates those dynamics within the 24 model. um, and I need to look at that, but I need to have all my ducks in a row before I can sort of and have all those things nicely laid out. Anyway, that'll just sound like gibberish to people. I was talking to someone about what I guess I will call the metagram model of the false ego complex, but the basic kernel of it, which is just the 6 stages. And I was talking to them about, and how those 6 stages, how I've always thought of them as being overlaid onto the 17 model, and that thematically you can understand that the 6 model itself is constructed from the kind of the meta container which the 17 model actually provides, because the 17 model is in some sense the base of consciousness, is the base of metaphysical reality. which is the sort of, so it's almost like the metaphysical, immaterial substrate within which um, cognition, but also perhaps would be better to call it metacognition in some sense, because anyway, is occurring, and that metacognition in some sense is the containers are framed like from what I just said, from the features that I just detailed, but then the actual the substance or the contents of it, although it has that substrate that it's sitting on top of, like so it has the basic organs are there, but the thing that is the charge that is being held by those organs, um, this is that's a psychological metaphor, like the anatomy of a of a system that is in the process of processing a computational task, a thought, which is and essentially the six model in Metagram of the false ego complex is a loop. It is an argument. It is an argument of an emotional tones that is residing in the on these organs. The charge of which is residing upon these organs, and these organs um, can be seen as like the can be taken from the 17 model. So you can superimpose from wherever the death is, which is the death or the atrophy of a particular dimension of psychological reality, then everything is happening inside of that in some sense, because all the dimensions exist within each other within the order presented by the 17 model, and so it's all happening on one dimension, but then as it's happening on that dimension, it's also happening on the in the later dimensions above that one. So because those later dimensions are within, it's like Russian dolls, concentric circles. You go up in number that way. So the base of the pyramid, the first dimension, is the biggest Russian doll that contains all the other ones. And then this is also slightly complicated because you can go above the 17th. When you go above the 17th, you reach one again. So that's also kind of a bit like a fractal in that sense that it's infinite. It starts again. So the Russian dolls are infinite as well. But anyway, um, and the sixth model, therefore, anyway, I was okay. So yeah, I'm just saying that so it's just people can have a picture of something about like what I was talking about. But then the thing is that I was just telling him what the sin was in essence, and there was something that I didn't get to say about the sin because we sort of moved around a bit too quickly. But the sin is actually is almost the truest feature of the metagram complex, missing the mark, as it were. But sin is some sense sin is the revisiting of the condition of sin is the revisiting and the restimulation of the decision to um, to endorse the death or to resonate with the death. In some sense, the death is fundamentally a fiction. The death is the relegation of liberty, or let's say the fluid functioning of a particular dimension of psychological reality to being blocked, to being stopped. And it's stopped essentially by the ideation of some image that replaces the liberty to decide, to be a chooser. You no longer have the freedom of choice because the image, in some sense, inherits the character of your. It becomes an authoritarian symbol in some sense, and then you're stuck sort of rationally aligning everything with that image in some sense, and so that image just sort of proliferates um, like a virus, and it has a sort of rational alignment into everything, and it gets its threads into everything. But essentially, that image it also makes all meaning in consciousness gets lost because meaning then becomes rational alignment with the image, and essentially the image becomes the self-image. And so this, in spiritual terms, is called the beast. because the image is then it no longer has free will, it no longer has reason, it no longer has a choice. The beast is just part of the environment. It's just conditioned by the environment. It's camouflaged by its environment. It is sequitur with the world. It is just another part of the world, and therefore its passions, its feelings are just natural, um, or just adaptive. You know, it's just as long as it's true to the beast, as long as it's true to its own image, that's the closest thing that it gets to truth. But essentially, it's lost. It can't. It's lost its epistemic agency. It doesn't have a. It is not the guarantor of the veracity or the verity of its. It doesn't have cognitive integrity that is being fueled by its agency. In some sense, in an indirect sense, it is being fueled by its agency, but by its agency's um, conspicuous slavish devotion to the image. In some sense, the idolatry of the beast, or the self image, the idolatry of the self image. And so that becomes the thing that makes meaning, is this image of the beast. And in some sense, I've also described this as being something that happens on the dimension below the death, would be something that maybe corresponds to the false prophet. And the false prophet essentially has to make a contract with the image of the beast, or at least to be obliged to the image of the beast. And in some sense, is the sin is similar, I think, to the false prophet contract. The sin is the re what's the word? Some sense, the sin might even be able to complicate things and make the false ego much more worse overall. In some sense, in that the sin can try to adapt and to try to novate the false ego contract by creating a new one, and in some sense trying to insert a new reality that is seen as a precondition before the false ego complex started. In some sense, the sin has a kind of recourse to go back to the redrafting table for the false ego contract, and it can try to novate the contract by essentially addition, not by subtraction, but by addition. And maybe in novation it can also do something. So anyway, there's something interesting there. But in some sense, what the sin is trying to do is it's trying to re-stimulate that period of life, or those conditions that led up to the necessity of the false ego contract. So the sin actually has to sort of, now it's weird because I think that is actually what it's channeling. What the sin is doing is actually channeling that moment, or that's channeling the feeling of that moment. It's constructing that as a kind of environmental unconsciousness. So the sin is connecting to the environmental unconsciousness, which is the precondition for the false ego complex, and this is somewhat outside of the false ego complex. So the sin is actually communicating with something that is beyond even the inner child, which is beyond what, and the inner child is often called the unconscious side of the mind. So it's actually beyond the unconscious. It's contacting the superego. It's contacting the in the Matrix analogy, it's when Neo is actually meeting the machines face to face, when he is being lifted on a cross to go meet the machine leader in the sort of in the super ego, beyond the politics of the Matrix and the architect and the Merovingian and all those sort of people, and Agent Smith, beyond all those things. And in some sense, he's going there because he's also needed to go to the super ego, because Agent Smith is perhaps a threat to their order on their because it's actually a problem for the super ego as well. Even though that there is there's this fundamental fracture. The super ego is fundamentally alien in some sense to the whole process of the other sides of the mind. It's alien to the inner child, the subconscious, the ego, which in the Matrix analogy, it's alien to the architect somewhat. The architect is just a little peon in the superego's world. The Matrix itself is a secondary concern. It's nothing. It's a sub process of just a way for them to make electricity to keep their world going. And then the ego function, which is Zion, is just a sub process of how the architect and the matrix are keeping themselves alive. The matrix says, the architect says, the point of the matrix is that it's hard to keep it alive without having the rebels. You need a way to manage the revolution, to have a controlled revolution all the time. And Agent Smith essentially is just a kind of calcified uh, uh, um, sort of consumed by the monotony of this stalemated war that never ends. Anyway, what else? Anyway, so the sin is actually the revisiting, or the recreation, actually, the recreation, and it has to have a kind of epistemological fidelity. It doesn't obviously have an ontological fidelity to the decision-making process that led up to the establishment of the false ego complex, of which it is it is the Zion, or in the analogy with the Matrix. It is there to sort of to, um, uh, uh, to to organize the rebellious elements, and to almost to take them out of this. It's there to take the human side of the glitches out of the matrix and concentrate them in the ego, so that the subconscious can continue its dream-like atmosphere, can preserve its the feeling body, the social mask, can keep it can keep to keep itself a functioning game of social, societal conventions, and a kind of and so the fatalism of the or the determinism that the subconscious is like an environmental, um, in some sense. I've always called the subconscious, um, because in some sense there are I've always described the false ego complex system as in some sense you can redraw it as three individual false egos. The one false ego is the inner child. The other false ego is the adult ego. So in the Matrix analogy, the one would be the architect and the machine. The machine element of the architect and the Merovingian, and the Oracle, um, and Agent Smith even, although perhaps Agent Smith is more subconscious than in the inner child, and then Zion, or the humans, the rebellious revolutionary humans, would be like Neo, and maybe the old guy who looks at how they've had machines there, and he was born outside, so he could never go into the Matrix, so he lives there in Zion, and he's a leader in Zion, and he doesn't make points, he just points out things that are interesting, like we live off machines, they live off us. It's interesting. He doesn't make points, he's too old. The whole functioning of Zion, it's got some defectors as well. Um, so you've got Zion as its own ego, sorry, as its own false ego complex. Perhaps you could reframe everything around Zion being its own false ego complex with its own inner microcosm, and the inner child the same, with its own inner a microcosm, and then the subconscious itself, the matrix itself, has its own contained character in some sense, but that one, it's not centered around, let's say, active intelligence. It's centered around hypothetical, abstracted, disembodied. It's the life of a community, as it were. It's the life of a city. Um, it's and I've always called that. So I mean, I've also had this as part of my model in some sense. So in some sense, it gets very confusing, because if you map all of these as being their own false ego complex, then a lot of dimensions are shared by each of those three false ego complex, and then they're doing different roles and different things. and so everyone's got their a different. Everyone is using the same thing for a different, to hold a different piece of information in their own internal false ego complex. So they're all got their hands in each other's cookie jars, but in this weird analogy, everyone has 6 different hands that have a particular order, that have a particular function, and they're all taking each other's cookies in some sense. And so it's a bit of a wrestling match between 3 in terms of how they relate to the to the at least the 17 model, which would be the thing that is the over that all these things are being overladen onto. Um, and I mean that I would just call metatype in some sense. And in some sense, metagram is probably a reconciliation of those things in terms of the emotional tones, because the emotional tones, in some sense, I think, have that built into it. And in some sense, you see, when I reverse engineer the emotional tones, we're going to have to verify some of what I'm saying on this point is slightly speculative, because metagram is such a complicated field, and to tell you the truth, I need to reverse engineer it because I have sort of lost my bearings there. But in some sense, I think what's also gone on there is it might just be that the emotional tones are. I'm really speculating wildly here. That the emotional tones are actually constructed from just. No, they were constructed when I only had 1/6 model. Hmm. Anyway, they were constructed by signatures, and already those signatures are the emotional tones in some sense are slightly problematic, because how I actually defined each type, they're defined by 12 model signatures, and so there might be that might need revision, because those 12 model signatures relate to emotional tones which are interlocked into their own subset of weird sort of mechanics. And if that relationship between the 12 model and those mechanics is better delineated. I remember it being so confusing. I wish I had kept better notes. But I remember thinking, no, that is actually a fixed correlation. That is actually a fixed thing. So I don't want to sort of um, prejudicedly um, disdain that work as being junk, but it might have room for revision. Anyway, well, or at least refinement perhaps. But okay, anyway, I guess I was speculating out loud, which is a completely different train of thought. That in some sense, that maybe it would be you can take 12 model signatures and you can get something which hooks you into emotional tones, but then there might be something like meta emotional tones which are constructed by the circuitry, the let's say, now this is circuitry that's not the same thing as metagram circuitry, but a kind of an added complication of circuitry that occurs when there are differing levels of development and different configurations of development between those 3 false ego complexes, and because essentially they can either give each other feedback, they can interrupt each other, or they can reinforce each other, or they can sort of uh, uh, I said interrupt already, but essentially that with their internal feedback in certain configurations, that certain emotional tones, in some sense, within those 3 false ego complexes, which you can sort of center around each side of the mind, can lead to certain calcified or crystallized, sort of devices, which themselves can create features and traits and pathological perhaps things, or just things that just get interacted, that are just very hard sort of stumbling blocks. And Scientology, to a large extent, could be um, almost empirically uncovering all of these different sorts of manifested features, which are just, um, in some sense, entrapping cognition, or blocking cognition, or sort of filtering cognition in a kind of, in a very, according to that kind of, because essentially they've just discovered it with the kind of, with the philosophical tools of essentially, um, I guess you could call it a kind of anti-realism that's based in phenomenology, the phenomenology of postulated, of postulating, everything, so reasoning everything up from pure postulation. Um, Anything. Anyway, okay. Without neatening what I just said up, let me just move on. So, what's the point that I should point out? So, anyway, so the sin is the revisiting of the, and sometimes it's almost the ad hoc invention of new, but in some sense it's the revisiting and the restimulation of the decision making process of electing the death, or electing the image of the beast. And so when you are revisiting that, in some sense, sin is almost one of the most positive parts of the false ego complex, because in some sense it's the most truthful part of the false ego complex, because at the same time it is actually agreeing that the false ego has failed, and therefore it is giving itself permission to start again, but it doesn't necessarily have to start again. So sin, in some sense, is the final step in the false ego complex. And the problem, in some sense, is that when people are, I mean, so in general, you see, like, it's weird because you can't make a hard and fast sort of rule and say, well, sin is positive. I mean, everything in the false ego complex is fundamentally pathological, and everything is negative if it's done too much, in some sense. But in some sense, someone who would be considered, let's say, a better person or a more mature person would either be someone who could stay on their trial in their ego function, who could persist in their trial for long periods of time, and then having a sin every now and again to um, go back to their trial. But no, actually, I think none of that is actually possible. I think actually the only way to sort of have a stable, what people are, a mature person would, how they would stabilize their false ego complex, is that they would spend a lot of time in their vanity, in their inner child. They would just be stuck in their vanity, and in which that they would be observing their enticed lust. They would be observing their subconscious side of the mind. So they would stay in their vanity, and they would observe their subconscious, and they would not engage in their subconscious actively, but they would engage in it indirectly. And then at some point, that would be unsustainable, because there would be something in their vanity that they would want to have revised. So then they would essentially jump scotch from their vanity to their um, to their trial. So they would pass through their subconscious, uh, because essentially they are indirectly, their subconscious is indirectly already neatening itself out, because they're observing their subconscious so carefully. and they are actually managing their subconscious like a kind of like a lens. The subconscious is there just to help them focus what's going on in their vanity in some sense. And then they are moving directly to their trial, where they're sort of debugging or troubleshooting and double checking that the edit that they wish to make is okay. And here they could also foul themselves up, because they could sort of get sidetracked, because essentially the trial is going to be host to all manner of negative um, implications, shadow implications of the whole subconscious field, which is which they're essentially going to be below as well, so that they can sort of be subject to a kind of what's the word, to diversion. They could be diverted in any number of possible directions of a sort of a self-flagellating sort of aspect. And then essentially, if they can get a hold of all of that, and they can sort of divert enough attention back to the original thing that had them go there in the first place. But you have to realize that essentially the contents of the trial the contents of the trial are not the unfiltered contents of the vanity. They the contents of the trial can only get there via the functioning of the subconscious, and especially the part of the subconscious, the enticed lust. And so the trial itself is the residue of the enticed lust, and the enticed lust itself is essentially a spiced up vanity. It's a vanity interpreted in the most radical and specious way possible to try to extract the most out of life. It's the difference between Cain and Abel. Cain is the vanity. He works for growing things in the farm, and he learned how to farm. And then Abel just didn't even know how to farm. He doesn't care about farming, but he just saw his brother and how he functions, and he's like, oh yeah, I could do that, and I could make it easy. I could make my life very nice. I could just live off of animals, and they'll farm themselves, and I'll just keep them safe. So the animals will be the farmers, and I'll just live off of them like a parasite and stop animals from eating them so that I can eat them instead. So that's the enticed lust. And then vanity is killed, the enticed lust, because it's hopeless. It's too self-satisfied. It'll never undermine. It doesn't. It's completely uprooted from reality. It's fundamentally parasitic in some sense. It's just a kind of it just wants to go on holiday. It just wants to go look for buried treasure. It doesn't care about how to make a treasure map. It doesn't care about topography. It doesn't know anything. That's why Cain kills Abel, and that's why the enticed lust always falls flat on its face. Because even if you found the treasure, it wouldn't last you. It wouldn't. You wouldn't. The good feelings would. The drug overdose would get to you. It wouldn't. It wouldn't be nice. You wouldn't sustain the niceness. The revenge of the enticed lust is the trial, and you can't. The consequence, you can't get away from consequence. And so in some sense the trial then is not does not care about the it's not the trial of the vanity, it's the trial of the enticed lust. And so when you're engaged in the trial, you're already a different person. You're not the same person that had the vanity. So the vanity is a complete, people are like more than one person inside of them. They are completely different. The vanity is like the inner child, and the trial is like the perception of the adult ego, or the adult sense of self, whatever. So it's the difference between the architect in the matrix and the humans in the matrix. It's a completely different set of affairs. It's a completely different set of relations, but they are relating to some of the same objects, but they're relating to them differently. Okay, so then what must also be pointed out here is that subconscious element, the enticed lust element. I'm just going to make an important qualifying point here, often a complicated point that needs to go back, but essentially, I mean, this is the problem, that within the six model, which is a very nice functional model, it's not the same thing as the experience of it subjectively, and it's more complicated subjectively. Or there are other models which need to be understood, that essentially that enticed lust is just more than one thing. That enticed lust is actually not just one dimension on the 17 model, but it's like multiple dimensions on the 12 model. It's something like that, or in some sense, it's that it's one dimension on the 17 model, but that same dimension is also being subscribed by the use of the other things as well simultaneously, and so it's the use of that dimension while that dimension is also being used by other things and other happenings that are happening at the same time, and so there's a co-mixture there, and that co-mixture is itself complicated because that commixture implies a whole other set of variables. And so there are other direct levers over that dimension that are happening simultaneously to what is happening there. And so that dynamism, in some sense, has to be modeled in a way in which looking at these six models, it just doesn't have the fidelity. Um, but anyway, and some of those levers, they need to be mapped, and I need to actually work out a priority order in some sense when you're dealing with one thing. Well, that also needs to be slightly probably refined and engineered, because the overlay on the 17 model, I need to make the overlay of the 17 model very, very precise, because otherwise when I go back to Metagram, I'm not going to be able to marry them nicely and to make sure that everything is integrated. Okay, moving on. Why was I talking about that? The subconscious. Um, and in some sense, I mean, a lot of what I say, some of the complications that I bring up, it's not as complicated as what I'm saying, because some of these things, I'm going to sound stupid when I say this, but essentially some of these things, some of these complications have been baked into the models already. And in some sense, I know that the emotional tone models, which come from the 12 models, the emotional circuitries in Metagram themselves already know this. That's what they are the model of. That's what makes someone have this metagram type as opposed to that metagram type. And some of the metagram types, just the understanding of those circuits need to be slightly understood, because some of those circuits, that's why some of the circuits are so complicated. And maybe people that actually have those types are not as complicated as the circuits um, allow, because essentially that type itself, that's just all the possible circuits, but they're not necessarily using every feature. They're not actually running energy or current through all of the different avenues. So in essence, that's just the kind of the overarching possibility. But then that's why those types are complicated by more pathologies or psychopathologies, because they have more complications that can happen. So they can develop in a certain habitual sense, and then later in life they switch on some of the other parts of the circuitry, and it just completely creates a feedback, a source of feedback and dysregulation. Um, and that might also be because essentially their original circuitry that they actually embodied was the weakest. It was the worst thing that they could do. That essentially the only reason why they didn't have psychopathologies right at the start was because so essentially they developed badly. They developed badly because um, they developed higher sophisticated or complex structures within their system first, and the contents of those structures also were, let's say, were blunt or rigid or something like that. And then when they wanted to develop the more nuanced ones, they became sort of robotically enslaved by the already sort of calcified, sophisticated elements, and therefore they end up with this kind of zealotry, which is very entrenched, and makes them difficult. And so the shapes of those circuits, in some sense, some of the shape of some of those circuitry, it's just possibility in some sense. It's not like that is what you have, but it's that is what you could have, and you'll have something within that form, something that exists within that form. But there are also, I need to also catalog all the different circuits, because I used to say, for example, that I can't even remember exactly. I think there might even be 6 different basic kinds of circuitry, or 5 different basic kinds of circuitry, and only 2 of those 5 might be the ones where you get really complicated things happening of feedback, where the other 2 of those 5s might also have other species of complication, but those species of complication might be like much more generic in terms of how they get complicated. Because, for example, you get like lots of different type. You get like at least 3 different types of double circuits, and like one of them is that you get real alternatives, which means that you can either do one or the other, or in some sense, I guess you could do both, and then you could have 2 circuits operating at the same time. That you could have essentially um, 2 seats of consciousness simultaneously, in some sense, um, which in some sense I think makes a kind of internal communion possible. And being able to be capable of having an internal communion would give one also a kind of better ways at self-regulating, and better ways at the, I mean, it could be used constructively or positively, but essentially that means that by yourself you could actually self-refine to some degree. Anyway, with the right, I mean, obviously it would still be like a tight wire act, or high wire act, to actually balance, and make sure, the ability for imbalance would be extreme, or the risk or whatever. But another one of the double circuits is that essentially it has a double circuit, but you have to have both of those circuits, and they come in a particular order, and there's no way of getting around them. But that might also still propose its own problems, which, I mean, empirically I don't know, but in some sense, but essentially one of the circuits I call the initiating tone, and then there's a secondary tone, which is another tone, and it's, I can't remember, but I think there might also be some variety there, where sometimes the initiating tone can just be the only tone that works, and then I don't know if that secondary tone actually is the conduit. I can't remember. I'd have to look at the circuitry things, but I'm pretty sure it's indicated. Um, but yeah, I mean, so I'm just talking about Metagram without being updated on what's going on in Metagram. I haven't looked at Metagram in a long time. I'm dealing with Metatype. I've still been dealing with Metatype, with a mind of feeling guilty that I need to be back in Metagram at some point. But this is good that I'm talking about it now, because I'm showing all the things that I need to sort of, that I just want to clear up, or at least, I mean, you see, the thing is about the 6 models and things like that, which is a kind of an overlay of Metagram and Metatype to some degree. Because my Metagram types is only one 6 model, and it's just, and then I already fathomed that Metagram does need to be elaborated. It does, definitely does. Because right now, Metagram, I've only got Metagram types of the adult ego. That's all I have. It might be the adult ego and the inner child. I always hope that well, I mean, that's what I thought, that essentially that in fact, my Metagram 6 model might be all 3, but in some sense, then it's much simpler, because it just shows 2 dimensions, or 2 emotional tones, which is the inner child, 2 dimensions and 2 dimensional, or maybe I shouldn't say dimensions because I don't know. but I had always wanted to overlay it onto the 17 model. But then when I did overlay it onto the 17 model, I said, no, this is not enough, and it's obviously there are more things that are being used here. And then I made a 10-dimensional overlay, and then I said, okay, well, how do I get? I've only got these 6 things. How do I get them over 10 dimensions? And then I just said, well, I know that it's a repeating pattern. The 6 model actually even always has a repetition within itself. Two of the dimensions, at least two of the dimensions, well, it's just two of the dimensions are repeated. So in terms of the emotional tones, oh, sorry, that's very confusing. Let me just say that again. So in my metagram model, there are six components, and which I've been calling 6 dimensions because I would also overlay them onto 6 dimensions. But then I wanted to have it overlaid onto 10 dimensions because I could tell that there were 10 dimensions that were related to these emotional tones even as well. And I actually went below it. So for example, I would put the 6 dimensions on top of the 17 model, and then I would take 4 dimensions below that, and then that would be the 10 dimensions that I wanted to cover. And then essentially those 10 dimensions, I just needed to work out how to replicate the emotional tones onto that, which I knew that I basically, I didn't actually do that. I didn't actually do the clerical work of actually doing that, but I know that essentially you should be able to do that. You should just be able to take some sequence in the emotional tone argument and just replicate another 4 and stick them at the bottom, and then that'll make a kind of, and then in some sense you'll have and then that will kind of describe 2 emotional tones. Sorry, that'll describe 2 independent circuits. That there'll be kind of like a super ego circuit, and then there'll be like a false ego circuit, and then there'll kind of be like an overlap, and that overlap of the 2 sixes will be over the lust and the death. But I didn't actually do that because I wanted to sort of to actually get to grips with my metagram, sorry, with metatype and the 17 model, because I had been so far away from the 17 model for so long that I needed to reacquaint myself. Now I think I'm much stronger with the 17 model. I think I understand it conceptually, although it's still slightly mysterious because it is complicated. Like I don't exactly, yeah, and so perhaps I need to focus on the emotional tone stuff first. Um, to see if I can route the emotional tone stuff and the components of the metagram into the 17 model, because then I'll have all my ducks in a row to actually get the actual model, the overarching model of the false ego. Then will be very nice. But I mean, already the level of detail and description that I have of psychology is can't even compare it to any other theory. I mean, this is actually a deep theory of mind. It actually has everything. It actually explains a lot of things, even or the features of it. I mean, in some sense, perhaps it's a bit sketchy. It's a bit rough because these things are still kind of. But as a working theory, even though it's not set, it's just the level of insight and detail. I mean, it is so far beyond absolutely anything. I mean, it's just a bit embarrassing that I can't retrace and reverse engineer every aspect of it because it's so fucking. The field is just so huge. I mean, it's so complicated. Um, so I mean, it's embarrassing how sort of lost I am in some of the details. But anyway, um, yeah, okay. So this is a sort of list of things to get into. Yeah, so I'm going to remake this chart so it has 5 columns, so it's easier to see the overlap between the 2 distinct threads that go through the 17 model. I'm going to make a nice pyramid as well that has the prepositional formulas of each of the dimensions, and I'm going to also make that pyramid so that you can actually see the beginning of a new pyramid and it's starting from an old pyramid, just so it emphasizes the fact that it's like a fractal and it's within itself, or that it continues on into new ones. And and I need to include a 12 model, which will be the sketchiest. Well, I mean, I don't like to mix the 12 model and the 17 model, and in some sense that might need to be refined in the future, but I should include a 12 model just to start thinking about those things together. It'll be nice to have that all on a nice big poster printed out, because then I'll have a good resource when I'm trying to fathom the emotional tones in the circuits. And then if I just have a good representation of my tables of the emotional circuits, which will have the 12 model signatures, then I can. And the emotional tone circuit, I need to make a diagram of the emotional tone circuits, which is that's hard in itself, because it's 24 things, and they correlate. That thing is, it's like a bundle of 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 tangled string. Anyway, and then maybe even just before doing that, just looking at the 17 model, taking out the final five, and then reordering the 12 and seeing the difference between that and the 12 model, and the 24 emotional tones. That might itself give some clues as to the structure of the counter offer of the 12. I need to reverse engineer that. And I also need to consider if there are alternative definitions for the emotional tones in because there was one thing that was ambiguous, which was in each guna, in each of the three components of the 12 model, the air, the fire and the water elements. Because the air and the earth element. Oh, yes, no, that's it. It's just because there are two overlaps. That's what creates the interchange between them, is because the air element in the one guna is indistinguishable from the earth element in another guna. That's how they fit with each other. That's how they create the same totem pole, as it were, of material energy, or how everything fits in their color palette of karmic energy, as it were, or materialized energy or objective energy. In some sense, the 12 model is just a way of looking at psychological. It's like a kind of psychological objectivism. It's a way to treat psychic energy or psychological cognition as a material force, and everything fits within that picture. You can make a solid narrative out of just those, out of just that color palette. And it's simple. It's just that uh, uh, one guna's air is another guna's earth, and then there was one other thing. Is that the only one? And then because of that, okay, well, that's how they relate to each other. But then there's also a conflation that happens within each guna, which I think is between the fire and the water. I think the fire and the water also conflate. So in some sense, each guna only has like it has, because of that alternative definition, which is an internal thing, which is not that what I've just said is not true in the 17 model, but it is true in the 12 model. But because it's true in the 12 model, and because these things are operating in the 12 model, it makes a commixture upon the 17 model, and that creates some of these mechanics. Okay, so I need to. Okay, so I've just remembered that, and I might be wrong about the water and the fire. That sounds a bit weird, but it's because there's there's something weird about the 12 model. I can't remember all the in terms of how the 12 model relates into making the 24 emotional tones. I need to reverse engineer that stuff. But anyway, okay. So that's a lot of that's pretty much that's a very clear picture of everything that I'm working on at least. Okay. Moving forward. Okay, making those. Yeah. Okay. Oh, yeah. And I should also add in my poster. I should add a model of the 6 model. Uh, So I should have the 12 model, and I should try to maybe have something of the metagram. But those two things will be so speculative that it'll be kind of embarrassing, because those things will obviously have to be. In fact, I'll just have to put them. I'll just have to put them in the corner, and because I mean, like, there's no clear way of how they would be superimposed onto it. Especially, I still don't know how the two different threads in the 17 model relate to the 6 model. I used to know that. I remember knowing that before I started my. I remember knowing that at 7 years old. That I had very clearly. I had that understood before I started my project. And I remember thinking, oh, I'm just going to have to reverse engineer this at the end of it. And now that's where I am. But anyway, um, I guess it's all in there. It just needs to come out at some point. This is an addendum, I guess, to something that I've actually recorded quite a while ago. I haven't uploaded it yet, or at the time of anyone else hearing this, I would have uploaded it, and this is going to be appended to that. That I just sort of, I'm about a third of the way through, and it's just going to be titled something, I guess, like metagram theory, and I was going into just the general structures of some of the basic things, and talking about the importance of the sin. Anyway, and I go into the matrix analogy and metaphor. And it is interesting that essentially, I mean, this is more just kind of speculative to some degree, but I think actually there were aspects that, as listening to myself talking about this, that I think I should have gone into further, or that are only occurring to me now. Um, that it's interesting that when Neo goes to see uh, the machine, that essentially the superego itself is in a poor state to some degree, because it's not had to deal with reality. It's had to just contend with creating the matrix, and which has within it this kind of this rebellion and things like that. But it's sort of the machine itself is not just kind of plugging into Neo to talk to him. It's sort of it has to it decides to create an authentic experience. It doesn't just like cart Neo off to the machine leader to talk to the machine leader, and the machine leader just kind of plugs into him. It's like they're all these little machines, and they're all just kind of part of the environment, and essentially, and then this kind of this face gets created to communicate with Neo, a physical face, and so it's sort of the superego is not even used to kind of condensing itself into an experience that is actually intelligible, uh, that communicates, um, because it's used to only dealing with itself. It's almost fundamentally autistic in some sense, and it's sort of like it is the environment, So it's kind of it's dispersed in a kind of and in some sense the only thing that brings it any kind of embodiment is its contact with Neo, which is effectively the representative of the ego function, of the judgment from the ego function, which has now sort of found its way to extricate itself from the control mechanism of the rest of the false ego complex or fiction or whatever. And also, but yeah, so I just wanted to point that out because that's an interesting kind of metaphorical thing, that the state, the poor state of the superego, which only starts to coalesce into a kind of embodied entity when when it is conversing with Neo. And then I'll just say as well that it's interesting that essentially there's more than one candidate. In some sense, the Merovingian wants power over the Matrix. The Merovingian would prefer to perhaps be in Neo's place, but he is just a kind of a childish monger of power, and he through knowledge. So he's kind of a representative of the kind of the pinnacle of the inner child in some sense, and he's also sort of cast in this kind of in this in this fixed dichotomy between him and the oracle, and he always wants the eyes of the oracle, and sort of, and he's embroiled in that sort of drama, and it's like, what would he do if he even had them? Would he even be satisfied? He doesn't know what he's trying to get anyway, in some sense. So there's that kind of drama, and sort of, and even if he were perfected in that way, like what he would then be the perfect narcissist. What would he even do? He would just kind of, um, uh, a perfected inner child. What is the meaning of a perfected inner child? That is someone who the rest of experience would just be a meaningless hypothetical extension of themselves that then would be obviated. It wouldn't need to be explored. So it would undermine the rest of or it would just sort of, it would allow for a kind of sort of entrenched transience of just everything could just go through you. It would be a kind of, maybe a kind of something like a kind of Buddhist enlightenment, that like nothing matters and you could just kind of experience it, and it would be meaningless and whatever you want, and meaningful in any way that you might want to project onto it. So it could just go on around you and you could endure it better somehow, something like that. And then, and it's interesting because you're not really told. The Merovingian obviously knows that he's not a human, and he knows that he's on the program side or the software side of it. But like, is he part of the drama? Is he part of the control? Like, why is he there? Is he, is he a refugee from the computer side? Like, is he there to just sort of be a kind of maniac? I think he's almost like an agent of superego, of a kind of superego self entitlement or something. He's actually he's a reflection of the kind of the relationship that the superego has to the false ego complex in general, and he's the kind of a reflection of the presence of the superego within the fiction or the narrative. So he's the kind of he's a prospective sort of vainglory, or a kind of one of the kings or rich merchants that is, in the great city of Babylon, in essence. But he can't help but be frustrated. He is wrath. He in fact he represents the highest degree of being drunk on the wrath of fornication with the whore, which and essentially the whole system is the whore to him, essentially. So he's the kind of the canonical kind of the frustration that the vanity represents, and essentially the clarity of that the vanity can actually arrive at something is like the eyes of the oracle. But anyway, so that's him. Agent Smith is like the subconscious candidate for essentially being they are all candidates of being in control of the false ego complex, and there's only one true one, which is Neo, which is from the ego function, in essence. Because in essence, the ego function is the one that actually bears the burden of responsibility for the entire structure, and is sort of downstream of all the other incoherences from all the other prior structures. So, if Agent Smith is to active, the ego function is maimed and made, is contracted and dysregulated, and if the Merovingian is completely in control or whatever, and takes the eyes of the oracle, then there's nothing for the oracle to sort of gift to the resistance, to the ego function, in essence. And so sort of the ego function is something that has survived the gauntlet of all the other structures and has to sort of corral all the other structures, and eventually can produce a form of dominance over the other ones. But in some sense, these are all the big players, and the big players are important because they need to be repurposed. They need to be perfected and condensed into solid things so that they can be utilized. And in some sense, I think that Agent Smith becomes the kind of the subconscious mirror and reflection of the false prophet contract, so that you've actually got the sense of the Son of God, the Son of Man, that is doing their role and essentially that happens through perfecting the character of the false prophet, so that one can turn it into the lake of fire, and then can use that container that is vacated to do the exercise of the Son of God, Son of Man, sort of orchestration of these hollowed out facilities, in the fluid functioning of the container of the false ego, which then is used for a higher purpose and transcended in some sense, and not entrapping into its internal dysfunction and drama or whatever, so that it's kind of fluidly cycled into a kind of enlightened state, that it's not resisted, but it's not endorsed. So, something like that. Okay, I need to go. Anyway, I'm not sure if this is in prior recordings or subsequent recordings to when this video is being released, but I am at some point going to make a recording that focuses on some speculative therapeutic processes and things like that, or I mean, actually not the actual therapeutic process, but the outline of a speculative therapeutic process. And I do think I have released something probably connected to the borderline therapy, the speculative borderline therapy, that gets into similar kind of themes in terms of I don't know. I know that I've made recordings that talk about perfecting the vanity. I'm not sure if it's in my spiritual vocabulary set of recordings, which will appear just after the release of this recording. But anyway, which will go into a lot of also the things that I just touched on, which is like the Son of God and the Son of Man, and relating that into sort of psychological terms. Yeah, so I mean, I realize that, definitely talking about the Son of God, Son of Man sort of thing is a bit of a misnomer at this point, but that is explored in the spiritual vocabulary recording, which is, I think, the next recording after this probably. No, actually, it is the next one after this. No, well, actually, there's one political one, and then it's a whole lot of spiritual vocabulary ones. Okay, yeah. Okay, I just needed to tack that on.